Yo soy Graeme Rocher y soy el creador de Grails y vivo en el norte de España. En inglés, sí. Pero mi mujer es una vasca. No tengo 8 apellidos vascos, pero en este caso sí funciona. Voy a hacer el resto de la charla en inglés, por 2 razones, porque es una conferencia en inglés, sí, y también algunos meses pasados estaba viendo unos vídeos de yo haciendo una charla de hace 2 años aquí en castellano, y qué horror, entonces no voy a repetir. Sí, bueno, mejor que hace 2 años, es verdad, pero bueno. Ahora la evidencia está ahí en YouTube para siempre y no puedo cambiarlo, entonces. Okay, so to English. So this talk is on the road to Grails 3. I'll be talking a bit about the features in Grails 2.3, which is the current release, what's coming in 2.4, and then we'll talk about Grails 3. So that's the agenda. For today, only got 45 minutes, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. So where are we? In the world of Grails, 2.3.7 is the current release. Out of interest, who here is using 2.3? 2.2? 2.1? Few hands, okay. So we've been trying to do like 1 release per month, just to keep up with the issue reports and so on. We've fixed loads of bugs. Interesting fact as well that Grails passed 1,000 plugins a couple of months ago. Or a few months ago, I think, before. And pretty impressive statistic now. So I'm going to run through what we delivered in 2.3 for those who hopefully encouraged you who are not on 2.3 to upgrade to 2.3. And then we'll talk about 2.4, 3.0, and so on. So what's new in 2.3? So we got forked execution, much maligned, but actually a very good feature if you stick to it. We got dependency resolution with Aether, complete server-side REST support, async programming, new data binding APIs, cross-site scripting prevention, a really important feature that a lot of people are aware of, but really important. Hibernate 4 support, some new scaffolding, controller namespaces, and a bunch of more minor features that couldn't make the list, but pretty significant. So in 2.3, we've switched to Aether for dependency resolution. So what is Aether? Aether is basically the dependency resolution engine from Maven. So the Maven build tool, the dependency resolution part of it was extracted into a library called Aether, which you can use in any project, and we use it in Grails now. Why do we use this? Well, because we were using Ivy previously, and Ivy has a lot of problems dealing with Maven metadata, snapshot handling, custom packaging types, and so on. So now with Grails 2, because it uses the same local repository as Maven, the same resolution engine as Maven, you get the same snapshot handling policy, you get the exact same dependency resolution semantics as in Maven. So I think it meets people's expectations of what should happen in dependency resolution, because most people are familiar with Maven's behavior. There is also a new dependency visualization graph, so you can visualize your dependencies really easily, shamelessly stolen from Gradle, which is pretty neat. Then on the REST side, we added support for RESTful URL mapping. So essentially, you can have single or multiple resources that map to a REST endpoint. So, for example, if you only have one profile domain class, that's like a single instance of the whole thing in your domain model, or you can have multiple instances of a REST resource. We've got support for versioning, nested resources, and a nice little new URL mapping report command, which allows you to visualize your RESTful mappings. We also added a at-resource transformation. As Bert said in his amusing talk yesterday, you can easily expose your whole database to the world just by adding that single annotation. Loads of flexibility to create security holes if you want, but when used wisely, it is a nice feature. So, just by annotating a particular domain class with @resource, you automatically get a REST API onto your domain. You can then customize that with different response formats. So if you want JSON or XML or only JSON or HAL or different formats, you can configure which HTTP methods to expose. So you can make it read-only, so only GET and is supported, or you can make it support all the different HTTP methods. So quite handy. There's also a new method. So in Grails, we've always had the 3 R's. When you're developing a controller, yeah, you typically, all you have to remember is the 3 R's: redirect, render, or return. Yeah, so you either redirect to something else, or you render a response, or you return a model. Those are the 3 concepts. So now there's a 4th R, respond. So mentally, it kind of fits with that pattern. So it's called respond. And basically, you can use respond to respond with a particular set of data. In this case, a list of books. And what Grails will do is automatically attempt to produce the appropriate content type for the requested content type. So if the client is requesting JSON, we'll produce JSON from that list. If the client is requesting XML, or request XML. If it's requesting HTML, what will happen is it'll transform that into a model, in a case of a book list model, which gets then passed to a view that you can render. So it's very easy to write one action that supports a whole range of different content types, right? So that's the aim of the respond method. The way it decides how to produce JSON or XML is via renderers, and these renderers are customizable. We call them renderers. So there's a bunch of default renderers. So if you want to just stick with the default, you can do that. You just leave it as is. But if you want to customize how the response is rendered, which is a lot of people do for non-trivial cases, you can basically specify different renderers inside your resources.groovy as beans. So for example, if I want my book rendered with HAL JSON instead of normal JSON, I can just specify that I want to use the HAL JSON renderer, and bang, I get HAL JSON. So who's ever heard of HAL? Yeah, so a few hands there. So for those of you who don't know, HAL is a kind of attempt to standardize a JSON format for REST resources. So it's basically just JSON, but it has additional links between resources, standardizing how resources are linked together. And it also specifies that hypermedia should be used. So you should really describe your resource in terms of hypermedia. So instead of returning application.json, you would return some custom media type like vnd.books.whatever plus JSON or something. You make up some custom MIME type. So check out the spec on HAL. It's pretty interesting. And yeah, it's pretty flexible. Obviously, a lot of it is plumbing as well. So we expect a lot of innovation around plugins in this area. There's already been some. Somebody just last week started producing a plugin, made a plugin to produce REST documentation based on these APIs and so on. So still a lot of innovation to come out of the plugin community that will build on this stuff, but the fundamentals of it are in good shape. Here's another example of, say you want to render XML, but you only want to include a certain property in the XML output, then you can just override the renderer, supply includes, and the properties you want to render. So you can easily customize the output. Okay, so another new feature in 2.3 is the 2.0 version of the scaffolding plugin. So the scaffolding plugin used to be integrated as part of Grails. It's now split into a separate plugin that you can get rid of if you don't want, which is nice. But if you want, you can also still generate the controllers that it generates in the version 2 are all by default RESTful, which is handy, and the views work with those RESTful controllers and so forth. And you can also, there's also a new command to generate a async controller, because we have a bunch of asynchronous programming supporting Grails. So in Grails 2.3, so if you want to see what it looks like to develop an asynchronous controller, it's a good starting point to learn how the APIs work. But once again, use scaffolding with caution. It is an anti-pattern just to generate code and then think it's going to solve all your problems. Scaffolding plugin, great learning tool and so forth, but proceed with caution. Miscellaneous other REST goodies. So there is a superclass in the Grails.rest package called RESTful Controller, and you can subclass it, and it essentially gives you all the implementations for all of the REST endpoints for performing CRUD operations against the GORM entity, yeah, automatically without you having to do anything. If you want to implement each one differently, yeah. But it gives you the basis of what a RESTful API against the GORM entity will be. So it's very easy to subclass, extend, override, and so forth. It's also useful because it's useful as a base for implementing nested resources. Because what happens with a nested resource, say you've got a nested resource where you got, say, /books/1/author, for example. Author is the nested resource. When in the query, you need to take into account the book ID, yeah? That's in the URL path. So Grails doesn't automatically do that for you. But what it does do with the RESTful controller superclasses, you can easily override and include that ID in the query by overriding query for resource or whatever and so forth. So it makes it easy to implement nested resources. Yeah, the respond method, which I already mentioned. There's also versioning support. So a common problem when creating RESTful APIs is how do you version them? Obviously, you need to evolve your API over time. Clients need to evolve. And if you just change it, then all your clients are going to break. So you need a way to support multiple versions and serve the right version. So there's versioning support by 2 ways that you can version. Actually, 3 ways, I think. You can version by URL mappings, which you just scope. You have a URL that says, which is quite common in some APIs, /v1/books inside your URL. So that's quite simple. But another way, which is becoming quite popular, is to use the request headers accept version. So in your URL mapping, there's a new, as well as specifying the control and the action, you can also specify a version property in your URL mapping. And then it will use the request accept version header to basically decide which mapping to route to. Yeah? You can also version via media types or MIME types. So you can create your custom MIME types, and you can have a v1 MIME type and a v2 MIME type. And based on the accept version header, it will choose different MIME types depending on what the client wants. So this is all documented in, I'm not going to go through it. It's a whole talk on itself, just the REST stuff. But it's all well documented in the new documentation for 2.3. Okay. Async. So in 2.3, we have new async APIs. There's some base foundational APIs. They all live in the async Grails.async package. And there's a useful factory class called promises. And this guy is essentially the foundational APIs. It's the default implementation is on top of gparse. So it uses the gparse library. But there's a plugin that uses, that replaces gparse for Reactor, which is another async framework. So it's extensible in that you can potentially plug in different async frameworks, whether it be Aether, there's an Aether plugin for Grails, I think, or Reactor, or whatever, or gparse. So it's basically a foundational API, and we have the notion of a promise, and you can combine these promises. For example, in this example, I've got 3 promises: promise 1, promise 2, promise 3. And they're doing trivial things, but you can do whatever in here, call into REST, make REST calls, or do whatever you want. And then over here, I'm blocking the current thread, saying wait for all these to finish and get the result. You don't have to block. There's another method called onComplete, which will not block, and you've passed it a this one will actually block until all these things are done, which is still useful because you get parallel execution, spread out and wait. But if you don't want to block it all, then there's an onComplete method which you can pass an event listener and so on and so forth. So there's all these foundational APIs which are useful. And then there's a handy little AST transform in Grails, which is called, in the async package, which is called delegate async. Why is this useful? So it's quite often that you need a synchronous version and an asynchronous version of the same API, right? It's very common that you need both. You don't always want something to be asynchronous. So what do you end up doing? You end up writing your synchronous version, whatever, that has all the synchronous operations, and then you end up writing another class that has the same method signatures, except it returns a promise instead of the actual value. So that's a complete duplication. You've got this, 2 duplicated APIs, one that returns the actual value and one that returns the promise for the value. It's just a pain in the backside to maintain. Every time you change one, or add to one, you have to add to the other. So what delegate async does is it takes every method of a synchronous class, and creates a method that executes the synchronous method asynchronously and returns a promise. Yeah? So if the book service has got a list books method that returns a list of books, it creates a promise to return a list of books method. Yeah? So this is really, really handy because you only need to write the synchronous version, you just add this, and you get your async API for free. Yeah? Very, very handy. And it's got some clever hooks as well into GORM. So if you're using GORM, one of the problems with using GORM is if you, in an asynchronous context, is in the thread that's split out, you need a session, right? A Hibernate session. Otherwise, you run into problems and you're opening multiple database connections. So delegate async will automatically deal with wrapping the thread in a Hibernate session in the context of GORM and so forth. So very handy. And speaking of GORM, there's asynchronous GORM. So there is a new async namespace in 2.3. So you just prefix .async in front of any normal GORM method. So this could be a dynamic finder, could be a criteria query, it could be anything, yeah? You just presync .async. And then what happens is it returns, instead of returning the person, it returns a promise to return the person, yeah? And so in this case, I'm executing 3 queries, completely wasteful and ridiculous, but for the purpose of demonstration, 3 queries that get 3 people, and I'm waiting for the results and getting them all. Don't do this in real life, but as an example of what you can achieve, this is what I'm doing. So it's cool because it automatically deals with binding the session to the background thread and so forth. Be aware that each person that gets returned in the results then becomes detached in the current thread, right? Because it's done in a... So if you have any lazy properties, you'll get lazy load exceptions and so on, unless you need to make sure your queries are eager. and gets all the data it needs before returning, right? Okay, there's also some async request processing. So inside of a controller, you can now return a promise from a controller action. So I'm using this tasks method, which is from the promises class, and the tasks method lets you specify a map of promises. Yeah. So I've got a keyed map here with a key called books, which executes a GORM query. I've got another one which executes another GORM query to count the books, so books in total. And then I've got some other value which I'm assigning a closure, and you can do whatever other hard work you want to do here. So I've got a map here of asynchronous, basically promises that I'm returning. And what happens is, when you return a promise from an action, which the tasks method returns a promise. I just omitted the return keyword here, but Groovy, when you don't have a return keyword, just returns, yeah. But it's returning a promise. And the framework will automatically detect that you've returned a promise. Oh, I've returned you've returned a promise. Okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to create a servlet 3 async request under the covers. I'm going to let the return the connection to the client. I'm going to execute the promise in the async in an asynchronous thread in the servlet container. And when that's done, I'm going to dispatch the action again, providing the appropriate model values as a map to the view. So it does all the internal guts of making sure that the view gets past the model, the map, so that can be rendered without you having to manually write that code yourself, which is a bit tedious, to be honest. So quite handy. Data binder. So in 2.3, there is a new data binding implementation. It's more flexible. Previously, we used the Spring data binder. But we found the problem with the Spring data binder is it doesn't have knowledge of GORM's domain model. So you think about Grails, right? Grails includes the notion of a domain model, but Spring doesn't really do that. It has it lets you use Hibernate or whatever, but it has no understanding of what a domain model is, whilst we do. So we know, for example, if you're binding to a domain class that if one of the properties of the domain class is an uninitialized proxy, you probably shouldn't bind to it, because that would result in a query and potentially several queries. It's probably not what you wanted. We know all these details also about the structure of your domain model. So this is a one-to-many, that's a one-to-one, this is a many-to-many. So we know more about your domain model in Grails than a Spring app does. Yeah. So the data binder for Spring was generic. And it didn't really know about the domain model, whilst we do. So we wrote our own implementation that does that, and it allows us to do much more interesting things. So we can do per-property formatting. It can be extensible. We can use cool things from Groovy, like allow per-property customization of the binding from the binding source. So in this case, I'm making sure that salutation, Mr., Mrs., Doctor, whatever is uppercase. For cases where more flexibility is needed, that's quite handy. And then you can also apply it's a lot more flexible than the previous implementation and supports a lot more cases than the previous implementation. So data binding is definitely a big improvement. And considering what a huge change this has been, like to just completely take out the Spring binder and replace it, folks have been really happy with this feature and how it's turned out. Another cool thing you can do with the data binding is you can now bind XML and JSON directly to command objects, which you couldn't do in 2.2 and below. So if there's an incoming XML or JSON request here, it'll automatically get bound to the person command object. Yeah. And there's APIs to customize how that binding happens, binding source and binding source creator. So you can customize the binding. Because, you know, when you think about REST, when you customize, say you customize the renderer of the renderer so that you output a different format with Grails' REST supply. If you customize the renderer and you're sending a different response back, when that content comes back, you need to be able to customize the binder. Otherwise, how can Grails know how to bind this new format that you're outputting? Yeah? Or say, for example, you create a REST API that sends back a CSV file. Grails doesn't know how to bind CSV files by default. But you can create your own binding source and binding source creator that knows if somebody sends a CSV file back, how to do that. Yeah? So it's immensely flexible, and you can bind to command objects, and pretty handy. Another thing we do is in data binding, if the argument to a controller is a domain class, then we automatically query to see if that domain class is there, if there's an ID in the request. So it saves you having to do the query yourself. If there's none, then null is passed. So pretty handy. And it can bind XML and JSON as well. I'm going to rattle through this because I want to get at least a little bit of time on my 2.3 and 3.0 stuff. So there's XSS Prevention. Important feature of this, we have double encoding prevention. So now if you all variables in Grails, all script variables that start with dollar and GSP are escaped automatically. Yeah, you never have to worry about calling encode as HTML. It just happens. And you never have to worry about encode as HTML being called twice because we have double encoding prevention. So each value knows when it's been encoded and doesn't get encoded again. And you can mark something as safe, use with caution, by using the raw method. Yeah. Okay, other goodies, Hibernate 4. Yeah, we have Hibernate 4 support. There's a new transactional transform, which, as Bert said, you can use on controllers if you really want to abuse the system, but you know, it's better to use it on a service. But basically it means no proxy is required. There's a dirty check transformation, which can apply to any class, and you can track changes. It's used internally for GORM, for MongoDB, but you can actually use it on any class to track changes to a particular class. Don't know if you have a use case for that. You can define exceptions as an argument to a controller action to intercept errors in your application, which is quite handy. So I can intercept a custom exception and render a different view, for example. Namespaces are supported on controllers. And that's it. I think I'll leave the QA till the end. Let's talk about 2.4. So 2.4 is going to have a number of things. SpringSource support, Java 8 support, Groovy 2.3, improved compile static, asset pipeline, modularization of a code base, and GORM and GSP standalone. So Spring4 brings some important features. One is we're moving away from our custom bean builder. You know how in plugins you got the bean builder syntax and in resources.groovy? Well, in Grails 2.4, we'll be using the native Groovy bean definition reader, which was ported from Grails' bean builder into Spring. So Spring now natively supports Grails' bean builder DSL, which we contributed from Grails to the Spring framework. So we're moving across to use that. And Spring4 also has WebSocket support, and there's already a plugin that takes advantage of that. So you can build WebSocket applications on top of the Spring4's WebSocket support. And I expect there'll be more plugin community interest in this area as things progress. So Groovy 2.3 as well. I'm not going to go into what it is in Groovy 2.3, but exciting stuff is on the way. Traits, Java 8, implicit closure cushion, which I think there's already something to. Lots more. Check out the roadmap. So that's coming in Grails 2.4. The resources plugin has been replaced by asset pipeline. If you want to know why, there's a link here. I'll be distributing the slides afterwards by somewhere, I guess, Twitter. But basically, we're switching from resources to asset pipeline. It allows, It does a lot more stuff at build time, and basically has better integration with things like CoffeeScript and Less, and it's just in general better than resources. Full documentation is there. David Estes has contributed hugely to the plugin and to Grails itself in this area, so big thanks goes out to him. Modularization. So we are really working on reducing Grails' dependencies and splitting out the code base into more self-contained bits. So just if you look at the Grails master in GitHub right now, you'll see quite a difference. Previously there was just, in Grails 2.3 there's just Grails Web, but in Grails 2.4 there's Grails Web MVC, Grails Web Site Mesh, Grails Web GSP, Grails Web JSP, Grails Web Servlet, Grails Web Common. There's all these submodules, and there's been a massive split in the code base. And also we've split out Grails core, so there's encoder, build specific APIs on this project API. The validation stuff is split out of Grails core. It's been and we've also pretty much eliminated all our dependencies on the commons libraries. You know, commons, lang commons, commons, beanutils, you know, there was all those external libraries. We've been slowly reducing and eliminating all unnecessary external dependencies. So Grails is very self-contained and modular. Why is this cool? This is cool because we needed to do it anyway for Grails 3, because we're going to need to reuse bits of Grails. We can't just throw away everything and start again, right? So we're going to need to reuse it. But it also means that standalone is now possible. And we've already seen a few examples of that. So I'm going to open this in. Well, this is a Spring Boot app, Spring Boot application. And look, it's using a GORM entity. This is completely runnable, so you can just, if you use GVM to install Spring Boot, you can just do Spring Run and this script, and it creates an application. So you've got this is a complete REST application, and it uses GORM queries, GORM methods. So GORM is completely usable within Spring Boot right now. And this is GORM for Hibernate 4. And this is possible because of the modularization work that we've been doing recently. And also, this is a Groovy script. So I'm using grab, and this is using MongoDB, GORM, instead of Hibernate. But basically, I'm grabbing that library. And because we have a lot fewer dependencies now than before, you're not downloading gazillion jars. You're only downloading 4 or 5 or whatever jar files. And this is an example of a script that uses MongoDB to create a bunch of cities with their geolocations. It's got a city domain class down here, and then it figures out based on their geolocations which is the closest city to London. Yeah, this is actual geolocation data. And this is all in a self-contained Groovy script. Yeah, no Grails here. I don't have to create a Grails application. Yeah, so GORM for MongoDB, GORM for Hibernate, now completely usable in Spring Boot, Groovy scripts, wherever you like, wherever you want to stick it, go for it. And then the same is happening with GSP. So you'll soon be able to use GSP in Spring MVC or Spring Boot or possibly other web frameworks as well. And going back to that example. Okay, so this is another Spring Boot app using going for MongoDB, you can see I'm using Spring MVC as the controller. But imagine for a moment that that wasn't there, REST controller wasn't there, and instead of returning a response entity, you could just use respond entity. Imagine this was a Grails controller, yeah? Suddenly, and imagine I had a dependency up here on instead of Spring Boot, I had a dependency on Grails Web MVC. Suddenly, you can create little microservices that are completely runnable just with a Grails controller and an entity, all within a self-contained script. Yeah? Is that Grails 3? Maybe, yeah? Maybe that's what Grails 3 can start looking like, yeah? We can have these short scripts, and you've got a Grails app, yeah? Easy peasy. So just imagine for a minute, instead of this being a Spring MVC controller, you could just stick a Grails controller there, and it works. That's what the future holds. We're not there yet, but it's happening. Okay? Okay, so Grails 3. I think I've only got about 5 minutes, so we're going to have to rattle through this. But the goals of Grails 3, basically, we're going to embrace Gradle. So you should be able to use Gradle. You should be able to, Maven as well. You should be able to use Maven. You should be able to use Gradle. It should just work. Packaging and deployment should be an abstracted concept. So if I don't want to build a WAR file, I want to build a jar file, I want to build another kind of file, you should be able to do that. It shouldn't be just, we shouldn't be tied to just WAR files. We should be able to reach outside of the servlet container into Netty, Batch, Hadoop, other areas. We want to extend the reach of Grails. There's a lot of value in Grails, though, 2.x. You know, the Grails plugin ecosystem, plugin model is still important, but we want to support multi-project builds. You should be able to easily build a Gradle multi-project build with a Grails application. We want to support microservices, so what I showed you before, a script there, you know, easy. Or it doesn't have to be a script, just a small Gradle application that provides your REST API. You should be able to do that. We want to remove bloat. We want to reduce dependencies, and that's what we've been doing with the code base. If you look Rails master now, there's a massive reduction in external dependencies. There's modularization, splitting of the code base, simplification, and you should still be able to build the monolithic Grails app, because a lot of folks like that out-of-the-box experience of having everything and, you know, just getting on with it and it works and whatever, and that's great. Grails, you know, you want to be able to have that out-of-the-box experience and build that monolithic app. But we also want to be able to support building microservices and more modular applications. Otherwise, Grails I think, will be left behind as all this movement around microservices expands. So what's going to happen? We'll be deprecating our existing build system. There probably will be a legacy bridge layer, so you can still run old Gantt scripts. But Gradle will be for the build. It's a lot easier now that everything is forked in 2.3.x. You've got the separation between build and runtime. Plugins, if you build time plugins, should be provided by Gradle. We want this notion of application profiles. So each application profile should be able to have distinct runtimes, distinct plugins, distinct packaging types. You can imagine, for example, creating an app and using the Netty profile if there was one. Maybe there will be one, maybe there won't. And then when you run Grails package, it produces a jar file instead of a WAR file, and you just run that. Yeah, should be dead easy. And we're going to be splitting this notion. So in Grails 2.x at the moment, a plugin basically spans all of these three areas. Yeah, a Grails plugin can potentially contribute to all three of these areas, and that really is quite bad because it links everything together and makes everything too tight. So we want to split the notion of code gen plugins, plugins that generate code, build time plugins, which should be just Gradle plugins, and then runtime plugins, which is you know, the courts plugins of this world, all the plugins that provide runtime services should be separated, and I should have no knowledge of these other areas, which currently they do. So we want this delineation. And then there's stuff that's for the chopping block. So there will not be Servlet 2.5 support in Grails 3, Servlet 3 and above. I think the last container to support, which was 2.5 only, was it Tomcat 5 or 3 or 4? Tomcat 5 or 4? Anyway, we're on Tomcat 8 now. I think it's time. Yeah. It was a long time ago, right? Move on. Gantt, probably be gone. GDoc will continue to support, but it will be extracted out because there's a lot of legacy documentation that's going to take time. And we recommend folks move to ASCII Doctor. There'll be some ASCII Doctor integration. There'll still be a Grails doc plugin that you could use if you want to continue using it. But integration tests will also disappear. There'll be more mix-ins. There won't be integration tests. The concept of it will just go. There'll only be tests, right? And there'll be a way to do an integration test via a mix-in, but the test will be runnable within an IDE. You won't need any special IDE-specific support to run integration tests like you do now. The converters and codecs plugins will also will not effectively be plugins. They'll be replaced by Groovy extensions. Filters, I really don't like, and there'll still be a plugin that lets you run old filters, but we want to investigate a new mechanism. Maybe not all of this will happen, but over time it will. So the challenges with Grails 3, compatibility between the legacy plugins, the build system, modularization as well, getting rid of servlet API independence, refactoring. It's going to be a big challenge. And because it's a new major version, 3.0, we're not going to be completely tied to backwards compatibility. So there will be some backwards compatibility. We want to make it easy to move to Grails 3, but not necessarily sacrifice the, making sure it works with 100% all plugins. That's never going to be possible. So that's Grails 3, and I think we have time for a Q&A, well, maybe a little bit of time. Very little, probably. Any questions about Grails 3? Y si queréis preguntar en castellano también puedes.
Have you ever considered using pre-boot segmentation for Grails 3?
Yes, we're definitely, obviously considering that. Boot provides a lot of things that we need. It already is Servlet 3 only. It already allows you to boot up an application inside Hadoop, for example. Inside, they have Yarn support for Hadoop apps. Inside, they got Tomcat and Jetty support for like traditional servlet containers. And it's quite feasible to write a boot plugin for Netty or so that foundation that boot provides, ultimately Grails is a Spring app. So easy, right? So yeah, definitely. The major work for us is really around the interface to a Grails app that users expect right now. You've got the Grails command and all those create controller, and that experience needs to be completely replaced, really. And we haven't really, the initial work that we have to do is around refactoring and making sure that we can reuse as much code as possible. Because you can't just throw everything away. There's so much value in Grails that you have to reuse as much as possible in Grails 3. And in the end, it'll benefit for everybody because Spring 4 has really great Groovy support, and we shouldn't be in this mindset. If you think of like how Spring is used, it's a library, right? You can use it in any kind of apps. Why shouldn't you be able to use GORM in any kind of app? Or why shouldn't you be able to use GSP in any kind of app? Or parts of Grails in any kind of app you want? So that's the goal. And that's, you know, why shouldn't you be able to use the Grails plugin system in any kind of app? The runtime plugins, I mean. So I want to just add the Grails plugin manager as a dependency to my normal Spring app. And then I want to use this Quartz plugin, and it just works, right? Why not? Yeah. Yeah.
Async supports that you showed before 3, I think. You showed promises. Is there a possibility to compose promises? Or
Yes. Yes. You can compose them in them. There's a promise list abstraction where you can have a list of promises and wait for them all. Yeah, there's a bunch of composition possibilities. Just check out the API. Yep.
Yeah, a lot of asynchronous new stuff for free. I think it's easy to change from the viewpoint, from the view part to the view. It's easy to change to a asynchronous program. I think it's transparent, but we have to do in the view part especially.
No, I mean, you just return an asynchronous model. The view doesn't have to know anything about asynchronicity. You just change your controller. But just remember as well that asynchronous applications don't really provide you any value unless you have a massive amount of connections. It actually can be worse, yeah, because what happens, you know, the performance can be worse because where it provides value is if you have 10,000 simultaneous connections, yeah. If you're using a synchronous application, then yes, Tomcat is going to run out of threads, or unless you have massive hardware and you just keep adding threads and you have this huge thread pool and monolithic massive. You can do it. You can scale it up by having enough hardware, or whatever. But fundamentally, with the synchronous application, you will run out of threads, you know, with 10,000 concurrent connections. But with an asynchronous application, because the connection is separated from the request processing, you won't necessarily run out of threads. You can scale the number of connections you have, yeah? But how many applications actually need that simultaneous connections, yeah? Does your application really need to support 10,000 simultaneous connections? That's the question you have to ask yourself, because a lot of applications, I'd say the majority of applications don't need that, yeah, right now. So just use with caution, right? Yeah? Any other questions?
I'm thinking in support of WebSockets in Grails 3. What is that support? Is it via plugin or is...
So in Grails 2.4 is obviously Spring 4, and you know the foundational stuff for WebSockets is in Spring 4 already. So there's already a plugin for Grails 2.4 milestone 1 that uses Spring WebSockets. So we want to see what evolves from the plugin community before putting anything official, or you know, we're not really keen on putting more stuff into core. It's better to leave it out. We may do something official afterwards as a plugin, separate plugin, but so there won't necessarily be anything official, but the base Spring infrastructure is there to build on. Yeah.
You spoke before about 3 areas to extend with plugins. What if we want to extend maybe 2 of them? We will have some kind of meta package.
3 areas to extend with plugins.
Yeah. Build time.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. The thing is, if you look at currently, when you create a plugin, it's possible to create a plugin that has currently in 2.x that has build time information, runtime information, and code gen all in one big, and it's very convenient. So yeah, it probably would be nice to have some meta package maybe that did the same thing, but there should be a separation, delineation of that, because it's created too many problems in the past. And it's just not clean. You know, your runtime shouldn't know about build time stuff. Okay, any other questions? Right, I think we're done then. Thank you.